So, all right. Welcome everyone to the second edition of Literature Across Borders, possibly the only transnational exchange for young people's literature anywhere in the world. I'm Meghaa, and I'm the co-founder of this exchange along with Dr. Alexia Casal. Alexia is the course leader of the MA Writing for Young People program at Spa University, where this exchange was set up. And I've been working in children's publishing in India for about 15 years now, and I'm particularly interested in children's books on history and environment. Our partners for this exchange in India are the Green Literature Festival and Ashoka University. At the heart of Literature Across Borders is the idea of pairing thematically related books written for young people by authors in the UK and in India. These texts are then read by students in both these countries to understand how authors in different cultural contexts are approaching similar themes. I am delighted to have the first set of students in season 2 of Literature Across Borders, John and Annette. They have read the first pair of books, Sam Stewart's Fireblood and Ami Majmudar's The Torchbearers. A quick introduction to both our student speakers. John is a first-year student of the MA English program at Ashoka University, whose interests include education policy and neurodivergence in children's literature. Annette is a second-year part-time master's student at Bath Spa, and she lives in Bath with her husband, her children, 2 cats, and an over-enthusiastic dog. So thank you for joining us, John and Annette. And I am going to launch right into my questions. The first question is, was this the first time you were reading a contemporary author from another part of the world writing for young people? And what was your sort of first impression of the books that you got to read? Annette, if I can start with you.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Meghaa. So yes, I think this was the first time I've read a book by an Indian author at middle grade level, and I absolutely loved it. I really enjoyed the world building. I thought it was incredibly well written, and I have been to India before, and what I loved about it was that it brought the Hindu gods to life for me. It really put an entirely different slant on my understanding of the Hindu gods, and I absolutely lapped it up and wanted it to carry on. So I really enjoyed it as a book. I really enjoyed it as my sort of first foray into Indian middle grade literature, and it was a fantastic choice to spark an interest in reading more. So yes, I really, really loved it.
Thank you, Annette. John?
I suppose by virtue of my location, it's not going to be the first time I've read an author that's British or from any other part of the world, really, because we grew up on Lewis Carroll, Enid Blyton, Roald Dahl, and such as it goes. And often the library is how I would often access books, right? And often you would find the library shelves littered with exactly these authors, and I had that, as well as the fact that I grew up Christian, that has a lot to do with the fact that I was reading a lot of fables, like Aesop's fables, but also the fact of just the cultural location of where I am at also means that I was reading a lot of Hitopadesha, which is known as, also the other version of Panchatantra. So yes, I would say my location probably has a lot to do with the fact that this is not my first time reading a British author on anything like that.
Okay. And did you enjoy that experience?
Absolutely. I mean, my interest in children's literature started as a child, because I too was once a child and terribly overwhelmed with the world and needed somebody to guide me through it. And so that experience still informs the way in which I view the text that I read now. And I have so much to say about this book, and I will get into it, but in very succinct words, I would say yes, it was absolutely enjoyable to read this book.
Okay, thank you. So, from a volcano that is on the brink of eruption to poison spilling into the ocean, both of these books, what they share in common is that they tie the idea of natural disasters to mythology, which is also very sort of culturally rooted in the sense in the Torchbearers, you have a reference to the Hindu gods. And in Fireblood, you're talking about dragons and you're talking about St. George. So I wanted to ask you, what do you make of mythology as a way into, the environmental discourse, Annette?
I think it's really interesting. I mean, I think there's a place to really talk about environmental destruction in most genres of book, and I think we should be, given where we are at this current stage in time, I think we should be looking for opportunities to do that where it's appropriate to do so. So I think it can map well into lots of different genres. I think using mythology is a really interesting way of doing it because people are already familiar with those stories. So you can build on something that people are already familiar with. So I think it's a nice way of doing it. I think mythology also helps because it allows you to sort of indirectly explore some of those issues. So it means that you can do it in a way that is not talking in terms of people's real lives, which can be quite scary for young children in terms of ensuring that children are both taught about the environment and the issues that we face, but not in a way that empowers them, but it's not too anxiety inducing, and that's quite challenging, isn't it? So it allows you to do it in a slightly more indirect way. And I think obviously the gods and the saints often have an already natural link to the natural world or to the environment, and so there's a lot that you can already build on in terms of using them as a tool to highlight some of the issues that face us today. And in the Torchbearers, I mean, I really love the role of, and forgive me if I say it wrong, is it Bhumi?
Yes.
Have I said that right? I hope so.
Yes.
Where she's sort of the personification of Earth, and I really loved that in the way that was described, in the way that she kept giving really to her own detriment, in that she was born to say yes. And I thought that was incredibly powerful, the way that captured how we sort of relate to the earth and expect it to sort of keep giving. So I really enjoyed that specifically around some of the environmental themes of the book. Thanks.
John?
I think this was something that had come up during the author sessions, and one of the things that really stuck with me was how Stewart basically said that there's such a big lack of books that are written from the perspective of a 9-year-old, and I think a lot of what I will say has to really just connects to that standpoint that she's chosen in terms of how she's written the story. So even when we're thinking about the mythological elements to what she's, and it's littered with it, right? Like she has talked about there's a character called Patrick, then we have of course St. George, and her own twist to the narrative being that St. George is not someone who slashes demons. That's not the version that this novel is going with, but rather a protector of dragons, and there's an entire lore behind that. And there are so many different ways in which legends come up. It's also, there's a nice shout out to the Arthurian legends that Arthur shows up. And I think one of the instances that I would want to hold on to when I'm answering your question here, Megha, is how she portrays the griffin. There's a gray griffin, and how that interaction plays out, largely because of the way in which, in that situation, Finn, one of the siblings in the story, the interaction that happens with Griffin in that moment actually is not how it's awe-inducing. It's quite literally that he was about to plummet down and he's saved by Griffin. But also, Griffin ends up being very moody. He gets angry basically on one of the other children, Charlie, and he ends up actually really hurting him, because of
Mhm.
which Finn and Tula have to work together to actually heal him back, Charlie back. And Griffin has to say, "I'm sorry for that." And I think that element of bringing in this sort of larger than life creature that quite literally is talked about as the mythics. He's part of this order of the mythics in the novel, but largely a character like that is wallowing. He's basically wallowing in his misery, and he's not looking out and not playing his role in the culture of Portal Door. He's just wallowing in his misery. But having that interaction with the children, this very like humble accepting that, I'm sorry, I really acted out there, I think really changes the ways in which mythology and children interact with each other, where it's not this sort of top down approach of this happened eons ago, 2000 years ago, 4000 years ago, and now you need to figure out as this 9-year old how you're going to find your entry point into this narrative. But rather to have this character of a griffin that has all of this baggage that comes with it, this cultural baggage of how we understand this character, but have a very human, I would say, more of a it's the griffin also, it's also the responsibility of the griffin to be on its feet, metaphorically, and respond to the children as they come to the griffin, rather than with all of his animosity. So yeah, that's definitely one of the ways.
So you sort of felt that it was humanizing these larger than life characters and making them more relatable. So it was,
Mhm.
in a way, making mythology more accessible to a young person who may not have that
Yeah.
sort of deep insight into, mythology. Okay, that's interesting. The other thing is, um, both of these books, they have a strong reference to parents and family ties,
Mhm.
uh, and directly or indirectly, um, these children are being influenced by their parents. So, I wanted to ask you a little bit about what role do you think parents have in, um, making this generation that is growing up in an increasingly warming planet more resilient to the environmental havoc that is maybe sort of seeing and experiencing around them. I know you'd have probably very different entry points into this because I know, Annette, you've spoken about your children. And of course, John, you're very young, but it'd be nice to get those sort of entry points into this conversation. Annette, we'll start with you.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? As you say, both of the books really talk about, parents and the parents' role and the family ties, both between the children and their parents and the children and their siblings. And I think there are elements in both where the father is trying to protect or shield their children from the threat of the world around them. But they're both also teaching them the skills that they need to survive in that new and different world. And I think that's sort of the role that you sort of try to play as a parent, where you want to you don't want these things to be happening for your children, but you're trying to, in an appropriate way, educate them and support them and empower them rather than making them fearful. So I think it's an interesting. I think they've done that. I've done that well. I think there's also something around that narrative around children and people generally having to work together. I think both of them have that very clear message that individually none of the children can solve the problem, but when they combine their forces, these, in their cases, powers, together, they can have a much greater effect. And I think some of the difficulty that we face around environmental challenges is that they are so huge that as an individual they can feel very difficult, but the collective power is much greater than the sum of its parts. And so I think that's quite an interesting message that they weave. So yeah, I thought they were both interestingly similar stories in that respect, in that these children had been separated from their parents in different ways, and then brought back together to solve and to meet the challenges that have been thrown against them by either the natural disaster or the sort of in the Torchbearers, things that have been caused by the demon. So yeah, it was really interesting, and yeah, it did make me reflect as a parent about how you get those messages across to children in a helpful and hopeful way.
Yes, I think, and I was just so amazed at the sort of resonances between both of these texts, even though they were written by women in very different sort of contexts. It always amazes me when you find these sort of synchronicities between how authors may be approaching similar ideas, and sometimes how we might all be really different, but what it keeps reiterating to me is that human motivations are pretty much the same wherever you go on the planet. We all want the best for children more often than not, and yeah, it was very nicely done in both of these books. But John, I think it'll be nice to have you jump in on this.
I think the role of parents has has a very central role to the very plot of this novel. I mean, it's the disappearance of the two children, Finn and Tula's father, that kind of really pushes them to quite literally step outside of the world as they knew it and have to embark on this sort of journey. And but it doesn't just end there, right? It also keeps coming back to the very fact of how much of this world that is prior to them, which is the world that Augustus, which is their father, was navigating, is now going to become a root. It's quite literally has larger stakes. The world as they know it is going to fall apart if they don't figure out how they can get the access to the hydrant that he made, that the potion that can equalize all of these forces of the world. So there's
Yes.
a very high stakes to their journey without them even having the full knowledge of what exactly their father was. There are moments in the novel where they really think about that. I don't even think I know my father that well, because of just how many things that are coming out as they are in the fortress and in Portal Door in general, and they're hearing about the story of what happened prior to them. Because
Right.
it's not just that this information was withheld from them, but it's also quite literally they had a very tragic incident, which was the battle that not only scarred the very island which they go through. It's blasted the island, is how it's said, and therefore there is all these uprooted, sort of scorched land. There's all this burnt grass, but it's also deeply impacted their psyche, because of which, now Finn has this sort of hunch on his back, and Tula is traumatized to the point where she can't even speak, even though they descend. This is constantly repeated in the novel, that they descend from a father who belongs to these four factions, all four factions. So does their mother, and she has the most powerful voice, singing voice. And that these two elements that give their parents strength become great impediments to their own children is
Right.
has everything to do with how the story unfolds. So there is even one point which I would like to reference here, which is the stone.
Mhm.
The stone is the telling stone, right? And there is this one moment in the novel where Finn really, because she keeps deflecting responses because she's so overprotective, Finn has to quite literally ask, "What would my father do?" I'm not asking you to give me advice. I'm not asking you to, give me a version of what to do. I'm asking for information. What would my father do in this situation?
Right. Right.
And I think that accessing the memory through this sort of stone is one of the ways in which I think we can understand just how these two children are having to, at every stage of the novel, having to navigate this sort of role that they have with their parent, which is not there, and they need to rescue.
But sort of more generally, John, I mean, what do you sort of personally think about the role parents have to play in, from a young person's perspective who doesn't have children yet of your own?
Mhm.
Um, what do you think of this role that parents have to play in making children more resilient to this sort of environmental devastation and all the other things that they have to face up to in today's world? I mean, just
Mm,
very briefly, if you could touch upon that.
Yeah, I think it really just comes down to don't protect to the point of removing the world as it is. Sometimes it's not about giving the facts of the matter. It's not about saying the world is ending, the carbon emissions at an all-time high. It's not. No, you don't approach a child like that. Nobody's asking you to shatter hope from the child as a parent, but really it's about that. Don't give them such a fragmented view of the world that by the time they are slowly coming of their own and they're having to navigate it, that they feel like you let go of their hand from a very early age, and now they have to uh, experience this world by it is like all from scratch in a way. I think that's one of the biggest conversations that we're having with response to climate change even right now, which is that it's all around us, we know it, and really the and our children are going to be inheriting this world from us, right? This is the world they're going to be entering. So I think that occlusion of the world and uh, for the sake of protection is something to be wary of
Mhm.
uh, in this relation.
I see. Okay, interesting. Do you think young people in your part of the world would be able to relate to these stories, Annette? Annette, you're on mute. Oh, you're still on mute, Annette.
Sorry.
Oh, that's all right.
Sorry about that. So yeah, I mean, I think both of the books will appeal to middle grade readers. I think Fireblood is a very fast-paced fantasy book, which I think middle graders love, and I think the authors talk about needing to move stories quickly now, so that middle grade readers who have lots of other options for their time, often via screens, you're really competing for their attention. So I think the fast pace of it will really appeal to them. I particularly like I really like the world building, and I can see that there's lots of different elements to this, which I feel like she's sort of only just started to explore, and there's lots more that can come from them. The idea of the houses, the mythical creatures, the legend, and the powers. And I particularly liked in Fireblood the tattoo series, where when they were gifted a power by a being as they came in contact with them. I really liked that idea, and I thought that's really interesting that you'd have them kind of lined up on your shoulder, these different powers. So I really like that, and I think there's so much scope of things that you could do with that going forwards. I think with the Torchbearers, I really would encourage children in the UK to read it. I think it felt quite different to other books on the market here. And there may be other books out there, but I've not read many other books which have such an accessible and fun take on a religion. I haven't, the characters around Vishnu and around Ganesha. I mean, they were just wonderful characters, and that's I haven't read many books like that, which really sort of humanize and bring fun to traditional stories. So I really enjoyed that, and it kept me reading. The humor, particularly Vishnu's punning, was absolutely brilliant. I mean, it was properly sort of laugh out loud, fantastic. So I really enjoyed that, and I think humor is a great way of reaching middle grade readers. So yeah, I think they will appeal in different ways, but I think have reach for lots of different children, both here and hopefully in India as well.
Thank you. John?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so many reasons why this should appeal to young readers from any part of the world, let alone my country. Because, like I said, I think just the honesty with which Sam Stewart has approached uh, this book, with saying that I didn't try to write this with the perception of I'm going to write it for all the middle graders, but really to locate her own voice as a 9-year-old herself, and to write it from that. There's just that level of transparency even comes in with the structure of the book as well. And it's quite modern. Like even the setting of it feels very, very modern. There are certain clothing choices that feel extremely modern, and it wouldn't feel dated, to say the least. Even some of the language use seems little bit colloquial, and I would say in those ways it has a lot of appeal. And I also think just the interactions between the children are so fun. Even their interactions as they're going through this wonderful journey. Fantasy in and of itself appeals to children for so many different reasons that one cannot just list in 1 minute. But I think this book in and of itself has a great example of how do you make sure that you really don't treat mythology and all these creatures from the past as this larger than life sort of awe-inspiring creatures, but as also playful people you can directly interact with, creatures that you interact with and that you can sort of play around with, so that you can get puzzles and clues to the future. So yes, I would say there's many reasons for why this book would appeal to young readers.
I was actually very interested in this also because the books, are, of course, they're both very accessible, which is great, but they also have these very sort of culturally rooted references within them. And I was wondering whether you felt that some of that might be lost in translation should people from another part of the world, particularly young people from another part of the world, read that. So, John, do you have something to say? And then maybe Annette, if you have anything to add to that. Uh,
Right.
mm,
Interesting. I suppose there is a sort of tacit worry about that, which Stewart has already responded to in the book itself, which is by incorporating so many different versions of storytelling. So there are versions of having this sort of like written code at the big bottom of the pages. Then there are these verse forms that the some of the characters have to go into to sing a certain way, which is like a formula. Then there are these other moments of other languages being used. I mean, quite literally, even the way in which Tula navigates the world is not just by the virtue of her using sign language, but it's also so it pays so much attention to her demeanor, her entire body to perform a sort of communicative landscape. So I think just by the incorporation of so many different ways in which one can use language, I think
okay.
answers and response to the problems that can come with translation to
So,
different
would I be
locations.
right to, sorry, would I be right to assume then that in this case, the sort of cultural references are great, but the way it is written, even if one doesn't have that sort of grounding in those sort of cultural contexts, it's still
Mhm.
very accessible and very enjoyable. Um, Annette,
Yeah,
I
I
was
think
also
that's. I would agree. I mean, I think what child wouldn't love a fish to land in their hands that starts growing wherever you're from. I mean, I think it's fantastic. And then if that fish is funny, I mean, that sort of transcends borders for me. I think it was really great. And I think what it did, I mean, I think they the book brought in lots of different gods later. And what I found myself doing was then looking up all the pictures online to just sort of relate the description. And actually, I think it's a really interesting way, therefore, of children starting to understand and explore, you know, um, different religions in a very accessible way that, yeah, as I said, I hadn't seen before. So I think it's both stands on its own as a story in itself because of the wit and humor and sort of humanity in both the children and the gods, um, but also, it leads you to really start to explore, and think about it differently. So I think there's multiple layers that actually I thought were really accessible, and you could just read it as a story and it would stand on its own. But if you want to be taken off and think about, oh, so let's have a look for that picture of Ganesha and what he looks like with his elephant head, then fantastic. And those are pictures that I was familiar with that were brought to new life for me by the book. So, it made me want to go to India all over again.
That's lovely. So I think that's another very interesting sort of take on this idea of culturally rooted texts. Sometimes there's this worry that will they resonate with readers from a very different culture that might not have a grounding in some of the examples I cited. But I think good writing is universally, enjoyable. But also, I think it's a good way into learning about another culture without feeling overwhelmed by that experience. That's really great. Thank you so much for those inputs. I was also wondering whether you think these sort of books then kind of subscribe to the commonly held notion of environmental literature and how they might contribute to our understanding of the Anthropocene. John, I'm going to come back to you to answer that one first. Yes.
Yeah, I think it does, but it also, by virtue of how it functions as the novel, it also reimagines and sort of speaks for itself in how it's responding to the concerns, I would say, of environmental literature. Because you have these two children who are navigating the world and quite literally are responsible for making sure that it doesn't end. So there are some tropes which I suppose would uh, fall under the requirements, I suppose, which sort of independent functioning of the nature in the plot, that is not just as a device for the betterment of the characters in and of itself. And those, I guess, conventional tropes it does respond to, but I think there are other ways in which it's understanding sensitivity. I think the larger departure and unique approach of this text has to do with how it treats sensitivity and the idea of perception, quite literally how the senses work, um, and gives it the sort of central stage when talking about this question of children in nature. Because of being a child, you are so sensitive, quite literally, to the world and how you're imagining it. How do we use that to put these two children in this world that's sort of in that extreme? It's building up to a sort of tension, right? And it's leading up to this sort of volcanic eruption that's going on. And what better way to think about that question, think about the urgency and the stakes of that, than a child who is going to be quite literally, from a sensory perspective, so open to all of that, so sensitive, and always uh, uh, registering all of that at every single layer of the body. So
So do
I
you
think
think
that's right.
sorry, so do you think then that these texts would fall under, like, would you very re- sort of naturally think of these books as environmental literature?
I would like to say yes.
Okay.
I would like to say yes.
All right. Sorry if I interrupted. Um, but Annette?
Yeah, I mean, I think they both obviously talk about environmental phenomenon. I think Fireblood is obviously more about a volcano, which as a natural disaster, whereas the Torchbearers is, I felt, more overtly on environmental destruction, sort of man-made environmental destruction, and so I think that that perhaps fits more with the traditional, or what I would see as the traditional view of what classes as environmental fiction, in it's with more of an ambition around educating or talking about climate rather than natural disasters. But it may be that they're classified both under that heading. I'm not quite sure. So I think the Torchbearers felt like it fitted more naturally under that heading for me, because there are references to lots of different bits of environmental destruction within that. So the drilling in the ocean, the poisoning of the seas, that fight against material greed, some of the cutting in the scene where Bhumi is fighting, the cutting down of trees and the effect on animals around that, where she's constantly having to produce more and more and more. So I think there's some very strong environmental messaging throughout the book in the Torchbearers. So that felt like a very natural fit under that heading for me, with a very strong narrative around our sort of collective responsibility around that.
Okay, interesting. On that note, I was wondering if there are books from your countries, which is UK and India. So Annette, probably from the UK. If there are children's books, but also just general books on the environment that you might want to recommend to John and to other people listening in from India that you think we should be aware of and we should probably read. And then I'm going to come back and pose the same question to you, John. Annette.
Okay, so at the moment, I'm actually listening on audiobook to Catherine Rundell's Impossible Creatures, and I'm absolutely loving it's actually fits with many of the themes that we've been talking about in terms of taking a very different type of mythology in terms of the impossible creatures sort of myths, and weaving environmental narrative around that. And it's an incredibly powerful and very direct environmental narrative, which I'm thoroughly enjoying, and her sort of background research that again I see in obviously the great knowledge that comes out of the Torchbearers around the sort of Hindu god stories, the research that Catherine Rundell has done around the mythical creatures that sort of floods through the book and their traditional characteristics. I mean, there's lots of parallels, and I'm loving that, and I would thoroughly recommend that as a really engaging, very fast-paced, again, very topical but accessible book around environmental issues, but that is framed in an accessible and way for children that both empowers them and gives them hope. So yeah, I'm thoroughly enjoying that, and I would definitely recommend it if you haven't read it already.
And is there any other recommendation? Any book?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, there is a lot of growing sort of green literature out there. I haven't read as much of it as I would like, so this has been a really good prompt for me to sort of dip my toes more into it. And it's not because I don't recognize it as incredibly important. I think it's quite a hard thing, and actually I've tried to do it myself. It's a very hard thing, I think, to write well, to get that balance right. And yeah, I think
is there a general book maybe? Sorry to interrupt, but is there a book that's not related to the environment, but which you would still heartily recommend to other people to read?
In middle grade, or in
generally,
right? So not about the environment. I've been exploring lots of different genres of book. I mean, actually, another environmental book that I did read last year, which I really loved, was The Last Bear by Hannah Gold.
Oh, yes.
And I really enjoyed that. That's for it felt like it was for a slightly younger readership, perhaps, in terms of middle grade audience. But again, very different, but I really enjoyed that. And I enjoyed the sort of country descriptors of that book. So I really enjoyed that. And that's obviously been very popular in the UK. So yeah, I love that as another book. I'll stop there. I mean, there's could go lots of different directions, but I think if we stick with the environmental themes, those are the two that I'm either enjoying or have enjoyed most recently.
All right, thank you, John.
Yeah, I decided to make recommendations connected to two of the things that I took away from Fireblood. One of them being that it's so sensitive to disability. So my first recommendation is going to be Kanna Panna. It's been written by Zaya Whitaker, and it's it's a picture book, so the readership is 5+, and it's a wonderful story about this boy who has a visual disability, and it's simple, it's to the point, but it shows the boy basically being able to have him shine in a moment of otherwise a very stressful situation for the rest of the family, but he shines because of exactly who he is and how he sees the world, rather than trying to fix it or any of that stuff. And I found it to be a very empowering story. So that's my first recommendation. And my second recommendation is going to be a classic, I suppose, just a Ruskin Bond recommendation, just because I feel that Ruskin Bond touches hearts in many ways than one. And this book is going to be The Cherry Tree, because I really liked the way in which the trees were treated in in Fireblood. And it's once again a fairly to the point story about a boy and a grandfather and a tree. There you go. That's all you need to know about what's going on in the story. But it's very heartwarming, and I highly recommend it.
Okay, that's wonderful. I really like Zai Whittaker's works, and I was with the publishers, Tulika Publishers bought it out, and I worked with them for almost 10 years. So it's an independent press in India, and yes, this is a lovely book. So thank you both of you for those recommendations. And now we sort of roll into our last segment, where we'd have you go full screen and read your favorite bits from both of these books. You can read the bit and then say why you liked it, or you could talk about why you would be reading this bit and you liked it, and then you go ahead and do the reading. So I leave it up to you, whichever order you want to do that in. Annette, would you be okay to go first?
Sure. So I'm going to read a piece from the Torchbearers, which to me illustrates the really clever use of language that I think makes this such an accessible and fun book for middle graders. So I'm going to read a chapter called Getting Ahead. Another hour or so to Chennai. That's where Kalakshetra is located, Ganesha said. Let's pass the time by getting to know one another better. We've only just met. If you think about it, let's talk about getting ahead. Getting ahead of what? Asked Prem, puzzled. And who's getting ahead? Asked Samita. Us or you? One question at a time, Ganesha said. He pointed at Prem first. Getting ahead, not ahead, is what I mean. While the Torchbearers were trying to figure this out, Ganesha pointed at Samita. Well, as for me, I had a head, but it was only later that I got a head, of course. I mean, you do know that I wasn't born with an elephant head, don't you? How insensitive of you to forget, Ganesha huffed through his trunk. It sounded like a foghorn. Samita looked aghast. Of course I know that. I didn't mean I'm so sorry. I'm just teasing you, said Ganesha, winking at her. And I'm not offended. In fact, I'm used to being the elephant in the room. The twins laughed, and after a moment, Samita joined in as well. Ganesha cleared his throat and began. It began when my mum gave me a chore. I was supposed to stand guard outside our home while she was inside, so I stood, and when someone approached, I stopped him. That someone was my father, but I didn't know it at the time. I told you earlier, he wasn't a very hands-on dad. He demanded to enter, and I firmly refused. Finally, in what I believe was a terrible overreaction, he lopped off my head. Ganesha paused, dramatically clutching his neck. The children, even though they knew the story, gasped collectively. It was another matter entirely to hear the story from straight from the horse's, or rather the elephant's, mouth. My mother ran out, and my parents had what must have been a legendary argument. Naturally, I was beside myself at the time. Samita giggled and then clapped her hands over her mouth. Ahem, yes, I was quite beside myself, so I couldn't give you the exact details. But my father felt terrible, and he wanted to make amends. So he went looking for another head. Thank goodness he didn't find a squirrel or something tiny. That would have looked silly. He found an elephant, and the next thing I knew, I was part pachyderm. Ganesha looked at the stunned faces in front of him with great satisfaction. That's how I got ahead. Now, Who's next?
Okay. Thank you. Yes, that's a very funny bit. It sort of just captures the humor so well. That comes out so effortlessly in in Ami's writing. John, we'll go with you now. Yes, 1 second. Yep.
Yes. So this is from chapter 20, and this was actually the section I was referring to when I said the interaction between Griffin and Finn. So here goes. At first, Finn couldn't work out what had happened, but once he'd pushed himself to his knees, he realized he was on the wing of an impossibly huge. What is this creature? At his feet and knees, and almost to his weight, was the softest sea of downy feathers. But above them, surrounding his shoulders and brushing against his face and arms, were strong quills of inky black. He stood slowly and unsteadily, careful not to trample or pull anything around him, his mouth hanging open in complete astonishment. The feathers around him flattened as he moved to standing, but Finn hardly noticed. He was completely mesmerized by the regal head of an eagle staring back at him along the arch of its wing. He did not notice the rush of people and creatures on the balustrades all around them. He did not hear the excited exclamations or muffled murmurs that rose and fell as if trying not to be heard. He did not realize that with every passing second, the motley crowds were growing, gasping, and pointing at him and the creature that had stopped him crashing to the ground. Caught up in this moment, oblivious to all else, Finn suddenly realized that it was possible to connect with another being instantly, to look into their eyes and know that there are many, many things about which you will both agree. Important things, like whether to run or hide, to sink or swim, to choose song or silence. And when those eyes are the size of your own head, well, staring into the bright glowing orbs of this creature's owl like irises, Finn knew that if nothing went disastrously wrong, if nothing interfered, if he were true to himself and to those around him, this mythical beast would be important to him, vital in some way. And then the world around him began to intrude. That's it.
Thank you so much. That was very nicely chosen, and I really enjoyed listening to the favorite bits from both of you because I really enjoyed these novels. I think this was the first where, and it just came so instinctively after I read Sam's book. I'd already read Ami's book, and then I read Sam's, and I was like, these fit together. Like, so I'm so glad that you enjoyed reading it. Thank you so much for reading these books and for so thoughtfully sharing your, ideas about these books, how they made you feel, and all of the other interesting insights you had reading them. And thank you for participating in the second edition of Literature Across Borders. Uh, we're at the end of the dialogue. And yes, this should be up and ready to be viewed by the world shortly.
Thanks. And it's been great to be part of it. Can I just apologise if I said any of the pronunciations not in the way they should have been? Forgive me for that. So yeah,
that's all right. Don't worry about it at all. I think it's great. It just shows how things translate and how they are adapted. So it's all right. There's no problem.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Annette.
Brilliant. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you. Bye bye.